Juniper Hale hadn't meant to speak. Not really. She was a new hire, an entry-level legal assistant buried at the bottom of a five-tier hierarchy in a corporate tower where sunlight barely touched the interns. She wasn't even technically supposed to be in the room, only observing, as noted on her temporary ID badge. But as she sat at the edge of the long mahogany table in Wexler Holdings' 39th floor conference room, something on the screen caught her attention. It was just a line in a contract draft, highlighted in green by the senior counsel. A harmless amendment, someone had called it. Just boilerplate. Standard stuff, except it wasn't. Juniper stared at the clause, rereading it, something prickling at the back of her neck. It was too vague, too broadly worded, and if interpreted aggressively, it could shift liability in ways that could bury an entire department. It was subtle, dangerous, and completely out of place in a merger contract like this. She looked around. No one else seemed to notice. They were nodding, typing notes, smiling at each other with that polished, legal confidence that only came with corner offices and 10-hour martinis. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then raised her hand, pulse thudding behind her ribs. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice cut through the room like the flick of a switch. Heads turned, a few smirks, one snort. The senior partner blinked as if she'd spoken in a language no one had asked for. "I'm sorry, miss," he asked, glancing at her badge without really seeing her. "Hale," she said. "Juniper Hale. There's something about Clause 47. Subsection C. The way it's worded, it's a trap." There was a pause. A full beat of silence where the room tilted slightly on its axis. Someone laughed under their breath. Another lawyer whispered something to the associate next to him. The man at the head of the table didn't laugh. Cassian Wexler had been silent the entire meeting, observing more than speaking, his expression a sculpted blend of boredom and calculation. He was tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in a dark gray suit that looked like it had never touched a wrinkle. His hands were steepled in front of him, fingers long and still. Now, as the room waited for him to chuckle or dismiss or correct the upstart intern, he slowly turned his head and looked at her. "What do you see, Miss Hale?" he asked. His voice was low and even, not angry, not amused, just quiet. She swallowed. The language in that clause allows for third-party indemnification, even in cases of internal breach. If the merger falls through due to mismanagement, the acquiring company can redirect damages back to the seller, which, if this draft is signed as is, means we're accepting responsibility without oversight. No one spoke. Cassian Wexler stared at her for a long moment. Then he leaned back slightly and said, "Everyone out." The lawyers blinked. A few looked at each other, unsure if he was joking. He wasn't. His tone hadn't changed, but the message was absolute. The room emptied in under 30 seconds. Juniper remained frozen in her chair, unsure if she'd just ended her career before it began or triggered something far worse. Cassian stood slowly and walked to the screen, rereading the clause in question. He said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to her. "You're not wrong," he said. She blinked. "I'm not?" "You're precise," he said. "You didn't guess. You saw it." She shrugged, still unsure what to do with her hands. "It just stood out." "No one else noticed," he said. "And those people make 10 times what you do." "I still make almost nothing," she said before she could stop herself. Something flickered at the edge of his mouth. Maybe amusement. Maybe something else. He stepped closer, and she felt the full intensity of his presence then. He didn't loom, didn't posture. He simply filled space like someone used to winning in every room he entered. "Where did you learn to read like that?" he asked. She took a breath. "Community college. And textbooks I checked out from the public library. I waited tables for 5 years and read contracts between shifts because I couldn't afford law school." He nodded once, not surprised, not patronizing, just processing. "Do you want to go to law school?" he asked. "Yes," she said before she could think better of it. "But I don't have the money, or the time." Cassian studied her for another long, quiet second. Then he said, "Walk with me." She hesitated. "Sir, I'm just Miss Hale," he said, already walking. "That's no longer accurate." She followed him out of the conference room, her mind spinning. She didn't know if she'd just been promoted, tested, or set up. But one thing was suddenly and undeniably clear. Cassian Wexler had noticed her. And that was never just a casual thing. Juniper had never stepped foot onto the executive floor before that day. Everything about it felt unreal, like the set of a show about power and money, where everything was too quiet, too clean, too cold. The air smelled faintly of leather, eucalyptus, and money. The walls were covered in modern art that probably cost more than her entire neighborhood. No cubicles, no chatter, no bad coffee. Just long glass walls, closed doors, and people in suits who walked like they never needed to run. Cassian didn't say a word as he led her through it. He didn't check to see if she was keeping up. He didn't explain. He simply walked like a man who expected the world to fall in step with him. And somehow, it did. She followed him past two assistants and a woman in heels who gave Juniper a curious glance, as if trying to figure out what the girl in thrifted slacks and scuffed shoes was doing behind the CEO of Wexler Holdings. Juniper held her head up anyway. If this was going to crash, she'd at least go down upright. He opened a door to a sleek office that overlooked the skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a city bathed in winter light, harsh and silver. His desk was perfectly organized, papers stacked with precision, no clutter, no excess. The man was as composed as the space around him. "Sit," he said, motioning to one of the two leather chairs in front of the desk. She did, carefully, folding her hands in her lap. Her mouth was dry. She told herself not to fidget. Cassian took off his suit jacket and hung it on a hook behind the door before walking to the bar cart in the corner. "Water?" he asked. "Sure," she said, not trusting herself to say anything more. He poured 2 glasses from a tall crystal decanter and handed her one before settling behind his desk, studying her with the kind of intensity that made her want to straighten her spine and look away at the same time. "Do you know what that clause you flagged today was really about?" he asked after a moment. "I can guess," she said carefully. "It would have made the company vulnerable. Opened the door for long-term liability disguised as shared fault. It wasn't an accident." "No," he said. "It wasn't." She exhaled slowly. "So someone wanted it there, buried in the noise." "Correct." She blinked. "Isn't that illegal?" He tilted his head. "Only if you assume morality is part of the equation." That made her pause. "Isn't it?" Cassian gave her a small, sharp smile. "Miss Hale, this is corporate law. There's what's legal, what's ethical, and what's profitable. Rarely do all three line up." She held his gaze. "But you took it out." "I did," he said, "because you noticed it, and because sometimes the game changes when someone unexpected walks in." Juniper shifted in her seat. "Why am I here, Mr. Wexler?" "I've been reading your file," he said. "Minimal background, no formal legal degree, no connections. And yet, in 3 weeks, you've processed more contracts accurately than half my mid-level analysts. I don't believe in coincidences." "I worked hard to get here," she said, "even if it was through the back door." He leaned forward. "I like back doors. They're where real strategy happens." Juniper felt something shift in the air between them. The formality was still there, but now it was laced with something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the beginnings of interest that had nothing to do with legalese. He opened a drawer and slid a folder toward her. "This is a personal project," he said. "Unannounced, delicate. I want you to look over the internal structure and highlight any exposure. You'll report directly to me." She hesitated, not touching the folder. "And why me?" "Because you see things other people don't," he said. "Because you speak when others stay silent. And because I want to know what you do when no one's holding your hand." She lifted the folder, trying to read the label. There was none. Blank, plain, heavy. "If I say no," he smiled, faint and unreadable, "then you go back to your desk and pretend none of this happened. But you won't." She hated that he was right. She hated more that she wanted to open the file right there and prove she could handle whatever test he thought he was setting. "I'll look it over," she said finally, "but I'm not here to impress you." "Good," he replied, "because I don't hire people to flatter me. I hire them to keep me honest." She stood to leave, folder in hand, her heart thudding in her ears. Before she reached the door, he spoke again, softer this time. "One more thing, Miss Hale." She turned. "That clause you flagged today? If it had gone through, we would have buried a competitor and walked away clean." Juniper froze. He met her eyes. "You cost me leverage." She swallowed. "Would you have used it?" His gaze didn't waver. "I don't know. That's the part that bothers me. And with that, he turned back to his screen. Juniper walked out of the office with the folder clutched to her chest, already feeling the weight of whatever she'd just stepped into. She had wanted a job, but this was something else entirely. Juniper spent the next 3 days dissecting the file Cassian had given her like her life depended on it. It wasn't just some random project. It was a full-blown corporate restructuring plan for a foreign subsidiary she hadn't even known existed. The documents were dense and purposefully convoluted, littered with legacy language and obscure internal transfers that made it nearly impossible to follow the paper trail, which she realized by the end of the first night was exactly the point. Whoever had drafted the internal pathways had done so with the intent to confuse, to hide certain transactions in plain sight, but Juniper had a gift for untangling messes. Not because she had formal training or certifications, but because she had spent years working 2 jobs, managing her mother's unpaid medical bills, and learning to decode fine print like her future depended on it, which back then it had. So when she saw that several shell contracts had been routing consulting fees through a nonprofit tied to a Cayman account, she didn't panic. She just took a breath, highlighted the sections, and kept going. By the time Friday came, her notes were precise, color-coded, and stacked into a binder that weighed more than most first-year law textbooks. She hadn't told anyone in her department. No one knew where she kept disappearing to, and she preferred it that way. The fewer eyes on her, the fewer expectations to manage. She arrived at the executive floor just after 8 in the morning. Heart pounding, hair pulled back into a low twist, she hoped made her look more composed than she felt. Cassian's assistant, a woman named Bria, who wore perfect lipstick and gave off the vibe of someone who could coordinate a war room in stilettos, nodded when she arrived. "He's expecting you," Bria said, standing to open the door. Juniper stepped inside and found Cassian standing by the window with his back to her, phone to his ear. He wore a navy suit this time, no tie, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked, as always, like control personified. "No, I said we stall until Q3, he was saying. "I don't care if they're panicking, let them. Panic makes them predictable." Juniper stayed still until he ended the call and turned to face her. He didn't smile. He rarely did. But his expression softened just slightly when he saw the binder in her hands. "I take it you've been busy," he said. She walked forward and set it gently on his desk. "I flagged 11 items. 4 are structural flaws, 3 are compliance risks, and the others are less clear, but I thought they warranted attention." He opened the binder and flipped through several pages, pausing now and then to glance at her annotations. She watched his eyes track her handwriting, watched the way his brow furrowed at one particular note she had marked with a red tab. He said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he closed the binder. "You know this wasn't a test of accuracy," he said. "I already knew there were issues in that file." Juniper nodded. "It was a test of how far I'd go." He tilted his head. "And how far did you?" "I didn't touch the personal records," she said, "but I saw them. I know what they're tied to." Cassian studied her for a moment, then walked around the desk and leaned against the edge, crossing his arms. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you didn't ask," she replied. "And because if I brought it up before you were ready to hear it, you'd shut the door." That earned her a look, one of those rare moments where he seemed to actually reassess her, not as an employee, not as a threat, but as something unexpected. He reached for a folder on his desk and handed it to her. Inside was a single-page contract, a new role, senior advisor to special projects, triple the pay, direct report to the CEO. "You want me to take this?" she asked, reading the header. "No," he said. "I want you to want to take it. There's a difference." Juniper glanced up, surprised by the honesty in his tone. "People who work for me," he continued, "either lose themselves or start playing like me. You don't do either." "That's rare." She was quiet for a moment. "What's the catch?" "There's always a catch," he said. "This time it's proximity. You'll see more than you want to. About this company. About me. I'm giving you the choice now, so you don't get to say later that I never warned you." Juniper closed the folder and held it in her lap. She knew what accepting meant. It meant stepping out of safety and into something bigger, messier, and far more personal than anything she'd signed up for when she first walked into that building 3 weeks ago. But it also meant opportunity, power, a front row seat to the mind of a man who clearly didn't trust easily. but trusted her enough to give her this. "I'll sign it," she said, meeting his eyes, "but only under one condition." He raised an eyebrow. "Which is? You don't use me to clean up messes you made on purpose. I won't be your shield." Cassian gave a slow nod, his mouth almost curving into a smile. "Fair enough." As she stood to leave, she paused at the door. "That clause I flagged earlier? In the merger?" He looked up from the binder again. "I would have walked if you'd let it stay in," she said quietly. He didn't respond. But for the first time since they'd met, she saw something behind his eyes that looked like respect. Later that day, when she returned to her desk, her inbox was already flooded with messages from departments she hadn't even known existed. And somewhere, buried between the lines of corporate power and hidden motives, Juniper realized that she was no longer just a name on a badge. She was a player now, and the game had truly begun. By the end of her first week as senior advisor to special projects, Juniper could feel the shift, not just in her title, but in the way people looked at her. The same coworkers who used to barely glance in her direction now paused mid-sentence when she entered a room. She wasn't invited to meetings anymore. She was scheduled into them without being asked. Some stared with curiosity, others with poorly masked suspicion, and at least one junior associate had already whispered the word favoritism behind her back. But Juniper didn't have the energy to care. She was too busy keeping up with the mountain of confidential work that landed in her inbox every morning, like clockwork. Cassian was relentless. He didn't micromanage, but he didn't slow down either. Every day he'd drop a new file on her desk or forward a chain of buried correspondence that required decoding like a legal thriller. He rarely offered guidance, only expectation. But in those rare moments when their eyes met across the room, when she caught him watching her with that unreadable intensity, Juniper felt something simmering under the surface. It wasn't romance, not yet. It wasn't even flirtation. It was tension. It was recognition. It was the kind of slow-burning energy that didn't announce itself but built, degree by degree, until it couldn't be ignored. That Friday, long after most of the office had cleared out, Juniper was still at her desk working through a contract review that spanned 4 countries, 6 currencies, and enough tax loopholes to make her head spin. Her screen burned white-blue against the dim lights, and she had just begun making margin notes when her phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "Cassian Wexler. Are you planning to stay here all night?" She blinked at the screen, startled. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Then slowly she typed, "Juniper. Depends. You planning to stop assigning me puzzles with no solutions?" The reply came back fast. "Cassian. You solved them. You're just pretending it was hard." Before she could respond, her desk phone rang. She picked it up. "Come up to the roof," his voice said simply. Then the line clicked off. Juniper sat still for a second, phone still in her hand, heart inexplicably racing. She didn't know why she got up and followed his invitation. She could have stayed at her desk. She could have ignored him. But her feet moved anyway, pulling her toward the elevator, up to the top floor, past doors she'd never opened before. The air was cooler up there, crisp and quiet, touched by the hush of a sleeping city. She found him near the edge of the rooftop terrace, dressed in his usual tailored suit, no tie, jacket unbuttoned. The city lights stretched behind him like a blanket of fire, and for a moment he didn't look like the man who owned half of downtown, but just another soul trying to outrun something invisible. "You know," she said softly as she approached, "this feels suspiciously like an ambush." Cassian didn't turn. "If I wanted to trap you, Juniper, you'd already know it." She walked to the railing, standing a few feet from him. "Then why call me up here?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because this is the only place in the building that doesn't feel like it belongs to the company. No cameras, no eavesdropping, just stillness." She looked at him, surprised by the admission. "I come up here when I need to remember that the world's bigger than boardrooms and quarterly projections," he said, "and lately you've been invading that space." Her breath caught. "Excuse me? I don't mean physically," he clarified. "I mean mentally. I think about you. A lot more than I should." Juniper swallowed, her pulse pounding somewhere near her ears. "That's probably a bad idea." "It is," he agreed, "which is why I haven't acted on it." She turned to face him fully now, her expression guarded. "Why tell me this?" Cassian finally looked at her, and the look in his eyes wasn't cold or controlled. It was searching. Because I don't want to play the game with you. I don't want to pull strings. I don't want to make you a pawn in whatever this is becoming. She crossed her arms. Then what do you want? He didn't move, didn't blink. I want to know if it's mutual. Juniper felt something split inside her. She'd spent weeks trying not to name what she felt. She told herself it was admiration, fascination, ambition. She told herself the tension was circumstantial, that she was imagining it, but hearing it from him made it real. It is, she said finally, but that doesn't make it smart. No, he said, but it makes it honest. They stood there in silence, the wind threading through her hair, the city humming beneath their feet. She didn't reach for him. He didn't close the distance. But something unspoken passed between them anyway. Something heavier than attraction and more dangerous than affection. You've got walls around you so high they could cast a shadow over this whole city, she said. And yet you keep climbing, he replied. She laughed softly, the sound surprising even herself. I don't know if I'm brave or just reckless. Maybe both, he said. They didn't speak again for a long time, but neither of them moved to leave. And when Juniper finally returned to her desk, she realized the strangest thing. She hadn't brought the folder with her, and she hadn't missed it. The following Monday began like any other. Emails, meetings, and the familiar rhythm of Juniper slipping deeper into the machinery of Wexler Holdings. But something about the air felt different. It was sharper, colder. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles quietly in the space between people. Juniper felt it the moment she stepped off the elevator and saw that her badge no longer needed to be scanned. The security system had been updated. She was now cleared for unrestricted access to the executive wing. No one told her. No memo. No ceremony. Just one more silent change in a company that specialized in hidden meanings. She found a thick envelope on her desk that morning, heavier than usual, with her name written in clean, blocky print. No return address. Inside was a contract, not for a company merger or restructuring, but for her. An internal confidentiality agreement, 10 pages long, bound with a red seal. It was precise, calculated, and undeniably targeted. Clause 3.2, buried halfway through the document, jumped out at her like a neon warning sign. It read, in the event of any romantic or personal entanglement between employee and executive, the employee shall forfeit legal protections under internal grievance procedures and may be reassigned or terminated at the sole discretion of the executive board. Her stomach dropped. She didn't need to ask who had written it. It wasn't legalese, it was strategy, it was control dressed as policy, and it was personal. She marched down the hallway, contract in hand, pushing through the glass door of Cassian's office without knocking. He was at his desk, phone to his ear, expression unreadable. He looked up as she entered, paused, and told the person on the other end, I'll call you back. Then he hung up and leaned back slowly, folding his hands in front of him. Juniper dropped the document on his desk with more force than necessary. Tell me you didn't approve this. He didn't look at the paper. He looked at her. I wrote it, he said. She stared at him, stunned. Are you out of your mind? No, he said calmly. I'm protecting the company. And you? No, you're protecting yourself, she snapped, with a clause designed to make sure if things get complicated, I'm the one who burns. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. I thought you'd want clarity. I want respect, she said, voice sharp. Not a document that strips me of rights because you're afraid of your own feelings. He stood then, slowly, not threatening, but no longer behind the safety of the desk. This isn't a fairy tale, Juniper. If people find out there's something between us, there is something between us, she interrupted, and no contract is going to erase that. Which is why I have to be careful, he said. You think I don't know what it would look like? You think the board won't use it against me? Against you? She stepped forward, her heart pounding. So your solution is to control it? To write it into a contract like it's a risk factor? He exhaled slowly. I'm used to writing the rules. It's how I survive. Well, congratulations, she said. You just wrote the one that might cost you me. The words hung between them, heavy and true. Cassian looked at her like he was trying to say something without actually speaking it. He didn't reach for her. He didn't apologize. But the silence that stretched between them was louder than either one of them could bear. She turned and walked out, contract still on his desk, untouched. For the rest of the day, she didn't hear from him. No messages, no visits, no sudden appearances at her office door. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, there was a note in her inbox. No subject line, no signature. Just one sentence. Meet me downstairs. She found him in the underground parking garage, leaning against his car, dressed not in a suit but in a dark sweater and jeans. No driver, no guards, just him. When she approached, he didn't speak immediately. He waited until she stopped walking, until the silence between them was thick again, but no longer sharp. I shredded the contract, he said. She said nothing. You were right, he added. It wasn't protection. It was fear. Juniper crossed her arms, but her voice was quieter now. What are you afraid of, Cassian? He looked at her, really looked at her. You. Her breath hitched. Why? Because you make me want things I can't control, and because you see through me in a way no one ever has. She didn't know what to say to that. She wanted to hate him for what he'd done, but part of her understood. It didn't excuse it, but it explained it. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the tired lines beneath his eyes. I'm trying, Juniper. That's the best I can promise right now. She didn't step back, and then stop writing rules and start living by the truth. And for the first time, he reached for her hand, not to pull her, not to own her, just to hold. And she let him. ChatGPT Skazal. The week that followed moved like a storm that had yet to break. Something in the air had changed between Juniper and Cassian, but neither of them spoke it aloud again, as if naming it might steal its power or expose something they weren't ready to deal with. At work, they kept their distance. Cassian returned to his usual sharpness, issuing directives through email, looping her into strategy meetings without so much as a glance in her direction. Juniper responded in kind, professional, sharp, detached. But beneath the surface, everything was different. She felt it in the way he paused when she entered a room, in how his eyes followed her just a beat too long, in the subtle tension that built every time they found themselves alone in the same space. Neither touched the other. Neither said what was lingering just beneath the surface. But it was there, undeniable, and waiting. It all came to a head on Thursday night, during a closed-door meeting with the board's legal team and two outside consultants. Juniper had been pulled in to review a crisis that had emerged from a former acquisition, something buried in the fine print of a 3-year-old transaction that had just now come back to haunt them. She was the youngest person in the room by a decade and the only woman. The energy was hostile from the start. One of the outside lawyers, a man with slicked-back hair and an expensive watch that probably cost more than her annual rent, made 3 offhand comments about her fresh perspective and surprisingly accurate analysis for someone new. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She simply corrected him twice, with case citations that left the room in silence. Cassian said nothing during that exchange, but his jaw tightened just slightly, and when the meeting finally ended, he was the last one to stand. Juniper stayed seated, gathering her notes, trying to hide how tense her shoulders had become. When the room emptied and the door clicked shut behind them, Cassian leaned against the wall and looked at her with an unreadable expression. You didn't have to stay quiet, she said without looking at him. You could have shut him down. If I had, he replied, he would have dismissed it as favoritism. You handled him better than I ever could. She paused, then looked up. That doesn't mean it didn't cost me something. His eyes softened. I know. There was a beat of silence, and then she said, I'm tired of pretending this is normal. That we're normal. Cassian pushed off the wall and crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet from her. We're not, he said, but that doesn't mean we're wrong. She tilted her head, studying him. So what are we then? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and touched her cheek with the backs of his fingers. It was the first time he'd touched her like that, tenderly, without motive, without power. She didn't flinch. She leaned into it, just barely. I'm not good at this, he admitted quietly. I know how to lead, how to win. But this is different. Juniper searched his face, and in that moment she saw it clearly for the first time. Not just the CEO, not the strategist, not the man who wrote impossible contracts to keep people at arm's length, but the human beneath all of that, carrying too much and not knowing how to set any of it down. You don't have to be good at it, she said. You just have to be honest. He smiled, but it was faint, almost bitter. Honesty is dangerous in my world. Maybe, she said, stepping closer. But it's the only thing I trust from you. He looked at her like he wanted to say something else. Something bigger, something braver. But he didn't. Instead, he lowered his hand and turned away, walking toward the window, arms crossed behind his back. Juniper followed slowly, stopping beside him. From up here, the city looked calm, all glowing lights and distant movement, like it belonged to someone else entirely. But here, in this quiet room, they stood close enough to feel the electricity buzzing under their skin. He spoke without looking at her. I never meant for this to happen. When I saw you in that conference room correcting people who've made millions off of silence, I didn't think, let me ruin this girl's life by dragging her into mine. I thought, she sees the truth. She doesn't look away. And that terrified me. Juniper didn't say anything. She simply reached out carefully and took his hand. He flinched at first, just slightly, but then his fingers closed around hers, firm and warm. We're already in it, she whispered. You and me. So maybe the question isn't what this is. Maybe it's what we're willing to fight for. His fingers tightened around hers. He still didn't look at her, but she saw the way his shoulders dropped, just slightly, like some invisible weight had lifted. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, not moving, but somehow closer than they'd ever been before. And Juniper knew then, this wasn't the end of their story. It was the moment it truly began. The fallout didn't come like an explosion. It came slowly, like a tide creeping in under the door. First unnoticed, then impossible to ignore. A week after their conversation in the boardroom, Juniper began to feel it. The glances from colleagues that lasted too long, the silences in rooms where her opinion used to be welcome, the sudden disappearance of her name from group emails where she had previously been a key contributor. At first, she told herself it was her imagination, that people were simply busy, distracted, focused on end-of-quarter results. But then the rumors reached her, quiet, half-whispered things that echoed in stairwells and break rooms. People talked about closed doors and secret meetings, about why someone with no Ivy League degree had moved so fast through the ranks. And while no one said it outright, the message was clear. Someone was pulling strings, and everyone thought that someone was Cassian Wexler. It came to a head the following Monday morning. Juniper walked into the office to find that her system access had been temporarily suspended. No warning, no explanation. When she approached IT, they handed her a printed memo with her name misspelled and an instruction to report to Human Resources for a procedural review of recent role changes. She didn't panic, not at first. But as she walked down the hallway, past people who avoided her eyes, something in her chest began to twist. HR didn't greet her with smiles or coffee. They sat her down in a room with no windows and handed her another printed document. This one phrased more carefully, but no less pointed. It was a request for a voluntary leave of absence pending an internal audit of performance and professional boundaries. She didn't need to read between the lines. They weren't questioning her work. They were questioning her relationship with Cassian. She left the building without signing anything, her heels echoing too loudly on the marble floor, and tried not to shake. She made it to the street before her phone buzzed. It was a message from Cassian, one line, "Come to me, now." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. She already knew where to find him. He was waiting in his penthouse office, alone, with the door open. The space was darker than usual, the blinds half closed against the early morning light. He was pacing when she entered, one hand raking through his hair, the other holding a file she didn't recognize. When he looked up and saw her, his expression fractured into something she couldn't quite name. Regret, frustration, maybe even guilt. "They came for you," he said flatly. "Yes," she replied. "They think I'm a liability." He exhaled sharply and tossed the file onto the table. "You're not, but they're trying to force my hand." "Why?" she asked, though she already had a sinking suspicion. "Because they found out," he said. "Or rather, they convinced themselves. The board thinks I compromise the integrity of our structure by involving you in executive matters. They think you're a weakness." Her heart twisted. "And what do you think I am?" He walked toward her then, stopped just inches away. "You're the only reason I've made half the right decisions these past 2 months. You're not a weakness. You're the one part of this entire place that isn't bought or broken. Juniper looked up at him, throat tight. Then why didn't you stop them? He hesitated. Because I thought I could protect you quietly. Handle it from behind the curtain. I didn't want to make things worse by pulling you into a public fight. You mean you didn't want to expose what this is, she said, voice shaking. You were protecting yourself again. His jaw clenched. I didn't know how to protect both of us. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavier than any argument. Then Juniper stepped back. I'm not going to be a rumor, Cassian, she said. I won't be the reason they undermine everything I've worked for. I know, he said quietly. So what now, she asked. They want me gone. His eyes burned with something fierce. Then I walk. She froze. What? I resign, he said. Effective immediately. I give up my shares, my title, everything. I walk away, and they won't touch you again. She was stunned. You're serious. I've been serious since the moment I saw you rewrite that contract and stare down 5 men who underestimated you, he said. I built this company to prove I could win. But now, I don't care about winning. I care about you. Tears threatened to rise, but she blinked them back. If you do this, it changes everything. I know, he said. But maybe it's time something changed. Juniper shook her head slowly. You can't burn your life down for me. He stepped forward again and gently took her hand. No, but I can choose something that's finally real. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers tightened around his. Then, without another word, she pulled him into an embrace. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. And for the first time, the city below them felt small, and the world inside that office felt like enough. Cassian's resignation sent a ripple through Wexler Holdings that no one was prepared for. Within 24 hours, media outlets began speculating wildly. Some suggested scandal, others a hostile buyout, and a few even floated theories about a quiet illness or internal betrayal. But no one guessed the truth. No one realized that the man who had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing had simply decided to walk away for a woman who never asked him to. Juniper watched it all unfold from a distance. No longer in the building, no longer part of the machine. After Cassian handed in his exit documents, he disappeared for a few days, retreating to a house on the coast that she didn't even know he owned. He left her a message before he went. Not a long speech, not a plea, just the words, I need to be sure of who I am when I'm not him. Juniper didn't follow. Not right away. She let him have his quiet. She used the time to breathe, to think, to remember who she was before all of this. She went back to her small apartment, the one she hadn't seen in weeks. She opened windows. She drank coffee slowly. She answered emails from law school she had put on hold. Reread old personal essays she thought were terrible, but now saw with kinder eyes. There was something about the silence after chaos that made everything sharper. And in that clarity, she realized something simple and profound. She hadn't just fallen for Cassian Wexler, the CEO. She had fallen for the man beneath the armor, the one who didn't know how to ask for help but had tried anyway. When she finally drove up to the house, it was early evening. The sky was painted in pale blues and golds, and the air smelled like salt and pine. The house was modest by his standards. 2 stories, wood siding, a wide porch with old rocking chairs. She didn't knock. She just stood at the edge of the steps until he came outside, barefoot and quiet, wearing a soft white t-shirt and jeans. He looked different, softer somehow, like a storm that had finally spent itself. I wasn't sure if you'd come, he said. I wasn't either, she replied. But I couldn't not. He stepped down to meet her. There was no performance between them now. No roles, no masks. Just 2 people who had been through the fire and come out scorched but standing. I keep thinking about the first time you spoke up, he said. That contract, that clause. You smiled like you wanted to fire me, she said, half laughing. I did, he admitted. Only because you scared me. You still do. Juniper tilted her head. Is that why you walked away? I walked away, he said, because I realized I'd rather build something uncertain with you than keep building something hollow without you. She stepped closer, slowly, deliberately. And what exactly are we building? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. No envelope, no label, just one sheet. She unfolded it with cautious fingers. At the top was her name, Below it, not a contract or offer, but a single line in his handwriting. No titles, no power, just us. Will you stay? Juniper looked up at him, and for once he wasn't trying to hide anything. She could see it all. The fear, the hope, the quiet question in his eyes. She didn't need time. She didn't need more words. She simply nodded, then took the pen he handed her from his other hand and signed beneath the line. He kissed her then, without hesitation or apology, and this time it wasn't rushed or stolen. It was real, slow, solid, like a decision already made. They spent the evening on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the light fade from the sky. He talked about the things he wanted to do next. Not companies or markets, but books he hadn't read, places he hadn't seen. She told him she had finally reapplied to law school, that she wasn't sure what city she'd land in, but that she didn't want to do it alone anymore. He smiled and said, "Wherever you go, I'll be 5 minutes behind." The wind picked up and she leaned her head on his shoulder. No headlines, no signatures, no fine print. Just two people sitting in the quiet, letting themselves begin again.